Hello and welcome to Cloudigy Law's Everyday IP show. Today we talk about technology and intellectual property legal issues that are making headlines. We talk about them in plain English so that we can help you understand how these things might affect your life. We hope that these live chats, this Everyday IP show, helps you find, protect, and grow your content and creation. I'm Jennifer Atkins, and with me today is Antigone Peyton. We are going to be talking about what I have termed Sherlock Holmes. Hi, Antigone.
Hi, how are you, Jennifer?
Great. Thanks for joining me today. So I could not resist the pun of Sherlock Holmes.
Right.
So this issue came up because basically, I guess between Christmas and New Year's, a story broke about a criminal investigation down in Bentonville, Arkansas, where the prosecutors and the investigators are trying to get information from Apple or from Amazon, from someone's Amazon Echo, claiming that there could be recorded data that might make a difference in a criminal investigation, in a murder investigation, actually. And so this led to lots of discussion on the internet about the Echo and what it records. But it also led to kind of a broader discussion about the Internet of Things. And Antigone, you have written and commented a lot on the Internet of Things and its impact on our lives. So I thought it made sense for us to have a little discussion today about the Internet of Things, what it is, what we're talking about when we say that, and how this is kind of coming to bear in the legal world.
Yeah, so the Internet of Things is my new fascination, and I think it's really the third technology wave, and we're just beginning to understand the implications of having all these connected devices with sensors that record information about their environment, including the people who interact with them, whether we want them to or not sometimes. And so this raises a lot of legal and practical issues as we think about as people who interact with these devices, and also us as technology lawyers, how we deal with the Internet of Things and how it's going to irrevocably change our life in good and bad ways that we're just beginning to understand.
Yeah.
So maybe I should start with, what do we mean when we say Internet of Things? Because people have probably heard that term, but they may not necessarily understand what it means. There's no classic definition of the Internet of Things. But to simplify the concept, it's really the idea that there's all of these objects that communicate across the internet, and they have sensors that collect information about their environment and about their activity. So when we talk about the Internet of Things, we're talking about everything from the smart device in your home, the Nest thermostat that will provide information about the environment and raise and lower the temperature based upon programming that you might provide through your cell phone. You might have your entire home connected. You might have one of these smart refrigerators that will remind you when you're at the grocery store that you need to get some milk, or something in your refrigerator is out of date. And then, of course, there's wearable devices like the Fitbit and other devices. The Apple Watch is another example, where these are creating very important information about your health and wellness, and with some of the devices, your sleep patterns. And we're now starting to see information that these devices are collecting being used by law enforcement and by lawyers in court to do a variety of really interesting things. And here's an example. We're showing an example now of health and wellness data from one of these health devices. And this is pretty sensitive information about a person. And when they voluntarily collect this information to help them with their own health initiatives, one of the things that they need to think about is the fact that the data can be used against them by law enforcement or in a court of law.
That's right. And so we saw photos of the Amazon Echo Dot, and we saw a photo of the Fitbit, and then that sort of information that is gleaned from the Fitbit. And, you know, it's funny because when you talk to people about who are using these products, and you know, there's been lots of news reports post-holiday that have said, the Amazon Echo was by far the most popular Christmas gift in the United States, right? Like everybody got Echoes this Christmas. Lots of people over the last, 5 or 10 years, the Fitbits and those similar things. There's an Amazon Echo. I did not get one. We thought about it. But so I think that's why this kind of, this headline that I saw in the Washington Post, but that, sort of made news all over the place about investigators trying to get data from the Echo. All of a sudden people were saying, well, hey, wait a minute, what data does my Echo have, right? And it's a similar thing with the Fitbit too, right? Which is you sort of are using this, you're all excited, you're using it to advance your health goals, you're uploading it all over the place. I know some people like engage in competitions with each other on the number of steps that they take. And you're sort of not really thinking about the fact that information that you're sort of putting on servers somewhere might be accessible to all kinds of people. And in fact, there was actually a Fitbit case, right? That I think that you had talked about maybe a couple of years ago.
Yeah, and I've written on it. There's actually 2 interesting Fitbit cases, one in Canada, one in Pennsylvania. I'll start with the Pennsylvania case, which is a criminal case. So there was a woman who was traveling for business, and she alleged that somebody attacked her while she was in bed and sleeping and assaulted her. But the evidence around the property when the police arrived, it wasn't making sense in light of what she said. I think it was snowing at the time, and there were no footprints outside the window or around the door, and other things weren't adding up when they looked at the evidence in the house. They then realized that she had a Fitbit, and they collected it and started looking at the data. And what they realized is she was actually awake and moving around the place when she claimed she was asleep. So that Fitbit data was used against her to show that she was basically lying. She was actually prosecuted for lying. And that is incredibly significant, because here's somebody who comes and says, I'm a victim, something terrible happened to me, there's somebody else a perpetrator, but her object that collects her data by design was used against her to call her a liar and actually prosecute her for lying to the police. So that's one example, and I think that's a really interesting one. Another example, the Canadian case involved a personal trainer who said that she was injured on the job and she had issues with quality of life afterward. Her lawyer actually contracted with a startup company that tries to collect this information and get general population information about health and wellness and help you understand where you are against that population data. They actually contracted with them to provide testimony and reports to look at her data to see how she was doing compared to the pre-injury time period and also against the general population. So that brings up actually an interesting question. Is this the new realm of experts? Are we now going to have a whole new cottage industry of experts who are focused on interpreting the data from Google Glass and Fitbits and whole cottage companies that are going to take the big data concept and crunching all this information from users, whether the users know that it's going to the company or not, to provide information for purposes of legal actions. And I think that we're just at the front edge of this issue, but I think that this is gonna, we're really opening the doors for a brand new industry that's just starting to develop.
I think that's right. And I think, particularly in a context where lawyers are sort of widely thought to be technologically incompetent for the most part. And so, these evidentiary issues and getting people who know not just how to access the data, but also how to read it, how to interpret it, how to determine evidentiary value, certainly is really important, and not just for lawyers, but for police departments, for investigators. I think it really is an area that is absolutely going to grow as we figure it out. And I think there are a few other implications that come from that. So we've talked about, we started this off by talking about a criminal case. And there are Sixth Amendment implications, I think, to this kind of evidence, right? So there is physical evidence, and you need investigators to testify about the collection of that evidence. There are eyewitnesses, there are people around who are used as witness. The Sixth Amendment gives you a right to speedy trial, but it also sort of gives you, requires that you be able to confront the witnesses against you. Well, what if your witness is Alexa, the Amazon Echo, right? Basically what you're now saying is that we need someone, some expert, right, to come on, to present the evidence, to talk about what any of these devices have, the data that they have. And then presumably you're probably also going to potentially have a Sixth Amendment right to have your own expert, right? If you're a criminal defendant, to try to poke holes in it. And we haven't even touched on the security issue, right? Which is, how do we know that this data is what it says it is, right? How do we know someone didn't go in and mess with your Fitbit data, or recreate it or re-engineer it or something like that? So I think, in addition to just having sort of evidentiary issues about how to get it in, there might also be some constitutional implications from this.
Yeah, so you mentioned the witness issue, and this is one of my favorite issues when we think about these objects and the data that they create. Who's the right witness to bring that information in? So perhaps it's easy in the Canadian Fitbit case, where you have this company that's actually crunching the data and offering population information. That's really the focus of the case when it comes to her diminished capacity to work and her quality of life. But let's go back to the Pennsylvania Fitbit case for a second. Who's the right witness? And does she have a right to not disgorge this information under the Fifth Amendment because it's self-incriminating evidence involving something that's on her body? Can she be compelled to provide testimony about the Fitbit data and authenticate it and say that it's hers? And there's also this question about interpretation of that data. So one of the big issues that's arisen with these wearable devices involves things like figuring out your activity, your number of steps and your heart rate, as well as your sleep cycles. So let's imagine somebody's a truck driver and they're driving for a period of time, and then they have certain requirements with respect to time off, and they're wearing a Fitbit. There's been some non-scientific studies already that have shown that the Fitbit analysis of your sleep cycles is wildly inaccurate, and people disagree widely about that. So if that evidence about his sleep cycle is being used against him to show that he didn't take the appropriate rest period, and therefore the company was liable for an accident that might arise, and they allege that he's sleep deprived, I mean, that's a significant issue. So one of the things we need to think about when we're looking at this data is, it's just like the traditional forensic technologies that have been around for a while and have come under fire under the last few decades. Things like DNA testing, where the testing has gotten better, and we've realized that we made a lot of mistakes in the old days when we were trying to use DNA testing to convict people of various crimes. Fingerprint analysis, that's another situation where we're having a variety of different issues. So Jennifer, one of the other things we want to talk about with our audience also relates to this question of the Fourth Amendment rights associated with search and seizure. So we have a certain expectation of privacy, and that expectation of privacy includes the right to have certain amount of privacy when it comes to our own data in our house. And the Supreme Court has actually talked about cell phones and how they contain a lot of private information. So one interesting issue will be what the Supreme Court and the other courts do when it comes to dealing with this privacy issue. Because going back to Alexa, this is something you put in your house, and it's an electronic communication device that you use to do things in your home. You don't put it in your car. You don't take it to the grocery store with you. You don't use it at work. So if we look at the traditional privacy analysis, we want to make sure that we're thinking about how we use these devices in our home and understanding how those privacy developments play in when we're talking about these connected devices in very sensitive places in the home.
Yeah, I think that that's right. And actually, that was sort of the first thing that struck out at me when I kind of first heard about this story. And we didn't talk about this. We sort of focused on the Amazon Echo piece of the story from Bentonville, but there's some backstory there, which is the house. So it's a murder case. There were a bunch of guys in this house late at night drinking, and then they all went to bed, and then, or this is the story the owner told, and then they woke up in the morning and the one guy was dead in the hot tub, right? And so as the investigation went on, the investigators figured out that this home had a smart water meter, right? So the water company had installed a meter that doesn't just sort of get your monthly use, right? It actually gives you real-time data, very similar to a Fitbit, very similar to a Nest or other things that keep real-time data. And so they were actually able to get this data, presumably under a warrant, and figure out that in the middle of the night when everyone was supposedly sleeping, all of a sudden there was all of this water use, right? And so I guess in the investigation, they figured that an altercation had occurred on the patio and someone had taken a hose to hose off the patio and get rid of evidence, right? And that was the water usage. And so it's interesting because the Fourth Amendment, obviously we're coming into your home, you've called the police, there's been a death, we get to investigate. There's sort of a broad scope of investigation there. And they were able to get this information fairly easily and probably pretty consistently with the Fourth Amendment, since they were in the house and able to get that kind of stuff. But I think there are issues with respect to exactly as you said, what if this isn't, something that's necessarily clearly within the scope, or what is my privacy interest? And you actually raised a good point of what if I'm at someone else's house, right? And they've chosen to have the wired house, and they've chosen to have the Echo or some other connected home device. But I haven't necessarily done that. And I think, look, this is all a really new area. And I think courts are just going to have to struggle with it on a case-by-case basis, as we've done over the last couple hundred years with the Fourth Amendment, and try to figure out the scope of what we're allowed to see and what we're not, and what we have an expectation of privacy in and what we don't. I mean, certainly one could argue if you're uploading your Fitbit and sharing it on Facebook with your friends, you probably don't have a reasonable expectation of privacy in that data, right? So I think, all of this is pretty interesting. The other issue that came up is, it's unclear exactly what data the Amazon Echo or the Google Home or any of these other things are really collecting, right? So we know that when you say to the Amazon Echo, hey, Alexa, buy me this thing, it goes to servers back in Amazon headquarters or wherever they are. And that, snippet of you talking to Alexa is recorded and it's processed, and Alexa responds and she orders you your dish detergent or whatever it is that you're trying to do. And Amazon collects that. What we also know is that the microphones on these things are pretty much always on unless you manually turn them off. And so the question, and Amazon has not answered this publicly, is Alexa actually recording when you're not asking Alexa to do something? And that's what this case is really getting at is, are you being recorded? Is there data that Amazon servers have that, is not someone asking Alexa to do something, but is just sort of ambient recording? And again, I think there's Fourth Amendment issues there. If you have an Amazon Echo in your home, do you have a reasonable expectation of privacy in the commands that you're giving to Alexa that you should know are going to Amazon servers? Or B, to just whatever's going on in your house that may or may not have been recorded by the Amazon Echo? And I think the answer right now is nobody knows.
Yeah, and this is not just an Amazon Echo problem or things that connect the network in your home problem. There are also other devices and increasingly a variety of kids' toys that involve kids talking to various plush toys, or a situation like Hello Barbie, which was my favorite sort of
Barbie.
creepy toy of the year. So Hello Barbie actually interacts with a child. You press a button on Hello Barbie, you talk to it. That data then goes back to a third party that they've contracted with to analyze the discussion and provide an appropriate response back to the Barbie, which will then speak to the child. And there's all kinds of issues that can arise when you're talking about recording information involving children, right? So there's that added layer of complexity. But imagine if you're in a situation where there's family disputes, there's domestic abuse issues, or child abuse issues. If you're the lawyer representing somebody in that family, you need to be asking questions about whether they have these connected devices. And you, the family member, need to be sensitive about this, and also following the breadcrumb trail to understand where this data is. Is it on a chip in the Barbie? And does it sit there until it's recorded over when it runs out of room and it needs that space on the chip again for other recordations? Is it all backed up at this third party place that's analyzing the information and reporting an appropriate response back? Do they ever delete that data? Or would they potentially have 2 years of your child and family conversations in the childhood nursery that a third party could request with a subpoena, or you could request in order to hear some very sensitive domestic conversations? So people need to think about this. And not only just in their home place, but also in the workplace. We have connected devices in the workplace. So we use Siri or other devices or other communication tools on our phones. And that's an area where there's a lot of technology development right now, whether it's third-party apps or the manufacturer that's helping us use voice recognition in order to do things we want to do on our devices. So we need to be thinking about this, not just from the personal home perspective, but also the work perspective, and consider how we wrangle this data sharing in and make informed decisions as consumers. Do we want to be using Siri? Do we want to be using Alexa? We have to understand the risks associated with that kind of behavior. And to your point about sharing health data, if we're sharing it on Facebook, this is kind of like the social media issues that are arising in courts. If you tell everybody your status, that you're divorced and you're dating a hot chick, and that's used in a divorce, the other side wants your Facebook feed to use that in a divorce proceeding, you're probably out of luck, right? And that's a reasonable decision for a court to make. But if you have sensitive chats internally on social media or direct Twitter communication with somebody, that's potentially a different analysis. And I think that kind of analysis should also be applied in this context. If you're using your health data in a manner where you really are just keeping it within the app and you have no understanding about whether it's shared with a third party, then probably there's a good argument to be made that there's a reasonable expectation of privacy, and it should be treated like other very sensitive private stuff that the courts have dealt with pre this digital and IoT era.
Right.
But getting back to the Fitbit for a second, I think that there's over 25 or 26 different authorized programs or apps that you can share your Fitbit data with. It's not just the Fitbit dashboard.
Yeah.
Think about the issue before you share that data with these other apps like Strava, your biking app. Mm-hmm. If you're going to share the data with a bunch of other apps, guess what, guys? We need to be reading that contract and seeing what they say in their privacy policy about what they do with that data. Do they in turn share it with third parties? Because we need to understand what people are doing with our really sensitive data. both as
Yeah.
consumers and as lawyers, because when we're lawyers, we can find the path of least resistance to get that data, let's say the Fitbit data. So not on the raw device, but maybe through one of these third-party apps, we just send a subpoena to the third party. So there's a lot to think about, no matter which side of the coin you're on.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think, the reason why these cases like the Arkansas case and the Pennsylvania Fitbit case and the Canadian case, why they kind of resonate and make headlines is because we are all just figuring this out, right? This is an area where sort of the world is moving very, very quickly. And we are getting used to technology and the ways that it helps us and the things that it can do for us. And we are sort of on the flip side, also just kind of discovering the pitfalls, right? And then the legal world, and as the courts always do, we're always a little behind, but we reason these things out, right? So as the first few cases come up and they get challenged and they resolve, and we kind of figure out where the courts are going. I always like to say, as new as everything is and as technology evolves, there's not a whole lot new under the sun in terms of the law and how we think about things and how we treat things. And courts are pretty adept at making some of these analogies. I think there are some pretty easy cases. If you've shared it with the world on Facebook, if you've shared it with the world on Twitter, you're probably not entitled to privacy interest there. I think you're right if you're keeping it sort of in a way that you view as only for yourself. The fact that it happens to be stored on a server somewhere, a court's probably going to look at that like a personal private letter or something and say, no, reasonable expectation of privacy in that. You need a warrant, you need a real reason to go after that. I think, keeping on watching this case, part of it too is, you said, look, read the privacy policies, and that's great. But man, we read them and write them a lot. And I definitely am just as guilty as everybody else of occasionally just clicking and not really reading, right? You can't get through modern life if you tried to read every single thing. You'd never buy anything because you'd just be reading for thousands of hours. But I do think that that's a really, really important point, particularly on these things like things that are collecting my health data, things that are collecting sort of data about that I would consider particularly sensitive, my sleep patterns and where I'm going and how many steps I'm taking in a day, potentially very sensitive stuff. So those are probably things that you want to pay close attention to. And, I think it'll be interesting to see whether this creates more public pressure on not just Amazon and Google with their voice recognition technologies, and Apple with Siri and the Android with their, all of the various voice recognition technologies, but also just on tech companies in general to really tell us exactly what's going on. So like I said before, Amazon has not said really what's stored. And as you said with the Hello Barbie, we don't really know, right? What's stored on that chip and what isn't, how long is it kept, where does it go, when does it erase? And they haven't really publicly said. All they've really said is, well, hey, data only gets sent to our servers if a request is made from Alexa for something. But they haven't said much about what's done with it, how long it's kept. They haven't said much about whether the Echo locally stores data. There's a lot of questions out there that in some ways, obviously as a private company, they don't necessarily have to answer those questions. But I'm curious to see if as these come up and as police departments get more sophisticated in criminal investigation and as civil litigators get more sophisticated about asking for this stuff, whether or not there becomes some real public pressure on these companies to identify exactly what's going on with this data.
Yeah, well, there's some practical issues with that. Companies are always modifying their technologies and the way that they do things, and those modifications are coming faster and faster. Those updates are coming faster and faster. So there's the practical issue associated with creating a policy that describes exactly how you do what you do, because I think for many companies in the tech space that are successful, as soon as you develop that policy and that description about how your technology works, it's actually out of date immediately. So that's I think one practical issue outside of we don't want to exactly tell you how we do what we do, and we're not legally required to. But let's move back into what this means for businesses, because we always like to come back to, okay, what do businesses have to think about in light of the technology issues that we're talking about during these shows? And businesses now need to really consider the connected devices, whether it's the connected printer in their office or the workers' Fitbit data. If they've got an employment discrimination issue or an issue involving theft of trade secrets, or a variety of workplace related issues, both the company and the employee need to think about their preservation obligations with respect to that data, right? Because I think we're beyond the point where people can argue that it's not relevant and you can just go ahead and delete it in your ordinary course of business. So this is a challenge for everybody who's involved with the Internet of Things objects to think creatively about how they impact their lives from a legal and practical point of view. And this is certainly an issue in the workplace that's, that hasn't been the primary driver for these initial IoT object cases. They've been accidents, they've been criminal cases, but I think it's just a matter of time before we have corporate espionage cases and cases where we're dealing with IoT objects and some really interesting legal issues.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's right, Antigone. So businesses, individuals, we all have to be careful about that stuff. Want to shout out hi to Samantha, who joined us on Facebook. I know there's others watching us on YouTube and other platforms. Really appreciate, Antigone, you joining today to talk about the Internet of Things. Man, there is a lot to unpack here. I have a feeling we could do a ton more of these shows. For those of you who don't know, we've done some podcasting and some writing on these issues in the past too. So if you are interested in more information, please check out our blog at cloudigylaw.com, our Decoding IP blog. As always, you can follow us on Twitter at Cloudigy Law. You can follow us on Facebook. We're all over the place. You can join us at our website, cloudigylaw.com. And of course, you can join us every other Thursday at 1 p.m. Eastern for our live stream shows. And we hope you are having a happy new year, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Thanks.